You ever been out somewhere, a dinner, a gathering, maybe even just standing in line, and felt that tightness in your chest when someone says something that cuts a little too deep and they laugh like it's nothing? And you stand there, smile tight, heart sinking, wondering if anyone else noticed what just happened? That's the quiet battle we fight in public spaces, learning how to hold our dignity when others don't see the weight of their words or the impact of their actions. Sometimes we shrink ourselves to keep the peace. Sometimes we perform just to avoid being misunderstood, and without even realizing it, we start losing pieces of ourselves in the name of being polite. But there are lines you shouldn't have to cross just to belong, boundaries you have every right to hold, even when you're surrounded by people. Because how you carry yourself in public, that's not about image, that's about self-respect. Most of us are carrying more than we let on. We walk into rooms with a smile, answer, "I'm good," even when we're not, and play our part just to keep things smooth. But inside, there's this constant tension, the fear of being judged, the pressure to act a certain way, the worry that one wrong move might turn eyes or shift energy. And we don't talk about it, but public spaces can feel like minefields when you're already emotionally worn. This talk isn't about rules or pretending to be perfect. It's about getting honest with ourselves, about the things we do out there that quietly chip away at our confidence, our relationships, and our peace. It's not to shame, it's to awaken. Because when you start noticing these habits, you can start choosing differently. And that's where real change begins. There's a kind of silence that brings peace, the kind that lets you pause, take a breath, and choose your words wisely. That's strength, that's presence. But then there's another kind of silence, the kind that swallows your voice, keeps your truth buried, and leaves you walking away from conversations feeling smaller than when you walked in. That silence doesn't protect you. It betrays you. And for a lot of us, it didn't start overnight. It started in moments where we spoke up and were dismissed, where honesty was met with distance, or where our needs were too often called too much. So now, instead of expressing how we feel, we retreat, we smile, nod, stay quiet, because we've learned that silence feels safer than being misunderstood. But here's the cost. Every time you hold your tongue to avoid discomfort, you chip away at your sense of self. You start questioning your own feelings. You start convincing yourself that maybe it wasn't that big of a deal. Maybe you're being dramatic. Maybe it's just easier to let it go. And before long, silence becomes your habit, not because it's who you are, but because you've forgotten how to show up in spaces that don't feel safe to be honest in. And I want you to know that's not your fault. That's a survival instinct. But survival and self-respect aren't the same thing. Relationships, whether with a partner, a friend, a family member, are meant to have room for your voice. Not just the parts that are easy to hear, not just the parts that keep the peace, but the whole you, your thoughts, your boundaries, your discomfort, your needs. Silence may keep the surface smooth, but beneath that calm is often resentment, exhaustion, and a deep loneliness that comes from not being seen. And sometimes people around you don't even know there's a problem because you've gotten so good at hiding the fact that you're hurting. So let's name it. When silence becomes a pattern, it's not humility, it's self-abandonment, and nobody wins in that space. You can't build trust on withheld truths. You can't build connection on half communication, and you can't grow in spaces where your presence is conditioned on your silence. It doesn't mean you have to raise your voice. It doesn't mean you have to turn every moment into conflict. It just means learning how to stay with yourself in moments where it would be easier to disappear. It means pausing long enough to check in. Am I holding back out of wisdom or out of fear? And if it's fear, then that's your signal, not to lash out, but to lean in, to gently but clearly speak up. Because the longer you go quiet, the louder your pain gets, and you deserve more than a life spent censoring your heart. You're not too much. Your needs are not a burden, and your voice matters even when it shakes, especially when it shakes. There's a quiet kind of pressure a lot of us carry, the pressure to be liked, to be chosen, to be the version of ourselves that makes other people comfortable. We call it being kind, being easygoing, being a team player. But underneath all of that is often something much heavier, the fear that if we show up fully, with our flaws, our needs, our disagreements, we won't be accepted. So we start performing, smiling when we're exhausted, agreeing when we actually disagree, saying, it's fine, when it absolutely isn't. And we become experts at reading the room, shape-shifting, adjusting, not to be real, but to be liked. At first, it feels like control, like you're doing what you have to do to keep the peace, to keep things running smoothly. But over time, that performance comes at a cost, because when you're constantly managing how others see you, you lose touch with how you see yourself. You start basing your worth on their reactions. Their approval becomes your mirror. And here's the painful part: the more you perform, the less known you actually feel. People may like you, but they don't really see you. And deep down, you know that. You know they're responding to the mask, not the person underneath. It's lonely, not in the obvious way, but in that quiet, aching way where you're surrounded by people and still feel like you're on your own. And what makes it even harder is that you can't fully blame anyone else because you were the one managing the performance. That's where the guilt creeps in. Why didn't I just say what I really felt? Or why do I always minimize my needs just to keep others close? And it's okay if that hits a little deep. You're not alone in this. So many of us were taught, whether directly or indirectly, that love is something you earn by being easy, pleasant, agreeable. But real connection can't be built on pretending. It can't survive on performance. Sometimes we don't even realize we're doing it. We've worn the mask for so long it just feels like our face now. But if you find yourself exhausted after every social interaction, if you're constantly worried about what people are thinking of you, if your peace only exists when everyone else is pleased, then it might be time to ask yourself who you're really living for. And I don't say that to shame you. I say it because I've been there. And I know what it's like to finally realize that approval isn't love, attention isn't connection, and applause doesn't equal peace. The shift happens when you start letting go of who you think you have to be and start reclaiming who you actually are. That means getting okay with not being for everyone. It means giving yourself permission to disappoint people who were only ever attached to the version of you that kept them comfortable. And it means learning to sit in the discomfort of being real, because that's where your freedom lies. When you stop performing, you make space for the kind of relationships that are actually worth keeping. Ones that see you, hear you, and choose you. Not for how well you perform, but for how fully you show up. A lot of people are walking around waiting for someone else to go first, waiting to be respected before they set a boundary, waiting to be valued before they speak up, waiting for someone to finally treat them the way they've been needing to be treated. And I get it, especially if you've been overlooked, dismissed, or made to feel small in your relationships. It makes sense that you'd wait for proof that it's safe to take up space. But here's the hard truth most of us don't want to face. Respect doesn't start with them. It starts with you. That doesn't mean you're responsible for someone else's behavior, but it does mean you teach people how to treat you by what you tolerate, by what you reinforce, and by how clearly you show up for yourself. And sometimes, without even realizing it, we hand over that responsibility. We make it someone else's job to notice our discomfort, to guess our needs, to meet our standards, without ever voicing them. And when they fall short, we feel unseen, unheard, disrespected. But if you don't set the tone, the room fills with someone else's rhythm. And often, it's one that doesn't include you. We don't always see the pattern. We think we're just being nice, being understanding, giving people time, space, grace, and all of that matters until it starts costing you your peace. Because when you constantly let things slide that bother you, when you keep showing up for people who only show up, when it's convenient, when you keep saying, "Oh, it's okay," even when it's not, you start internalizing the message that your discomfort is less important than their comfort, that your silence keeps things smooth, so you hold it. But respect isn't about smooth, it's about honest. And sometimes honesty is uncomfortable. Learning that respect starts with you means you stop waiting for someone else to validate what you already know. You stop shrinking in conversations where your gut is screaming. You stop making excuses for people who keep showing you the same patterns. And instead of just hoping they'll change, you start changing what you accept. That's where your power is, not in controlling them, but in choosing you. This kind of self-respect is quiet. It doesn't yell. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't seek revenge. It just gets clear on what's okay and what's not, clear on when to stay and when to step away, clear on the fact that you can be kind without being a doormat, generous without being taken for granted, loving without being walked on. You start showing up for yourself the way you've always wanted someone else to. And here's what happens when you make that shift. The people who were only there for the version of you that kept quiet, they'll fall away. It might hurt, but it'll also heal. Because the ones who remain and the new ones who show up, they'll see you. Not just the surface you, but the real you. The one who knows their worth, even when it's not handed to them. That's the kind of respect that lasts, because it didn't start with them. It started with you. Somewhere along the way, a lot of us were taught that having boundaries makes us difficult. That saying no means we're selfish. That speaking up about what doesn't feel right makes us the problem. So we learn to soften our truth, to tiptoe around our own needs, to apologize before we even finish the sentence. Sorry, I don't think I can do that. I hate to be that person, but... And we think we're being polite. We think we're protecting the relationship. But what we're really doing is making ourselves smaller to make others more comfortable. There's nothing wrong with being kind. There's nothing wrong with being flexible. But when kindness turns into self-abandonment and flexibility becomes bending until we break, that's not strength. That's fear. Fear of conflict. Fear of rejection. Fear that if we stand firm, we'll lose the connection. So we end up apologizing not because we did something wrong, but because we dared to draw a line. And that line is necessary. Boundaries are not barriers. They're the evidence that you know who you are and what you need to stay whole. The truth is, a lot of people benefit when you don't have boundaries. They get more of your time, more of your energy, more of your yes. And the moment you start reclaiming your no, you're going to notice some resistance. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're interrupting a pattern. A pattern where your silence served someone else. A pattern where your overgiving filled a gap that was never yours to fill. And when you finally decide to stop apologizing for drawing that line, you'll probably feel guilty. That's normal, especially if your self-worth has been tied to how much you can carry for other people. But guilt isn't always a signal that you're doing something bad. Sometimes it's just a sign that you're doing something new. Boundaries are about clarity, not cruelty. You're not punishing anyone by protecting your peace. You're not being rude by choosing rest. You're not rejecting someone by saying, "This doesn't work for me." You're just being honest. And healthy relationships can handle honesty. In fact, they require it. Because when you don't have to apologize for your boundaries, you also stop expecting other people to apologize for theirs. You create space where mutual respect can actually breathe. I know it's hard, especially if you've been the dependable one, the fixer, the one everyone turns to. But you don't owe anyone unlimited access to you. You're allowed to pause. You're allowed to change your mind. You're allowed to say, "I'm not available for that," without a 10-minute explanation attached. You can be a good person and still have firm boundaries. In fact, the people who truly care about you will welcome that, because they won't just want the parts of you that serve them. They'll want all of you, even when the answer is no. So let's start here. No more apologizing for the space you need to stay healthy. No more shrinking to avoid discomfort. You are allowed to take care of yourself without guilt, without fear, and without saying sorry. You ever been in a room full of people, conversations happening all around you, and still feel completely alone? That's what it feels like when small talk turns into a wall. You hear the laughter, you say the right things, you nod, you smile, you ask, "How have you been?" And answer, "I'm good." But somewhere deep down you're thinking, is this it? Is this really all we're doing? And it's not about being ungrateful or antisocial. It's about that ache for something more real, for connection that doesn't feel like a script. A lot of us are starved for depth, but we've gotten used to shallow waters. Not because we don't care, but because somewhere along the line, we started protecting ourselves. And small talk, surface level conversation, it became a safe zone. You can talk about the weather, sports, work, the latest news. No one gets offended, no one gets too close, and no one has to be too vulnerable. It keeps things light, but it also keeps things distant. And over time, that distance starts to wear on you. Maybe you've felt it with someone close to you, a friend, a partner, even family. You sit together, you talk, but the conversation stays in a loop. You leave feeling just as disconnected as when you arrived. And it's frustrating because you want to feel seen. You want to be able to say, "I'm not okay today," or "I'm tired of pretending," or even just, "Can we talk about something that matters?" But there's fear under that. Fear that being honest will make things uncomfortable. Fear that the other person won't know what to do with your truth. So you stay polite, you stay safe, and that wall gets a little higher. But here's the truth. Real connection asks something of you. It asks you to go first, to bring honesty into spaces that aren't always ready for it, to risk awkwardness for the sake of something real. And it's not always going to land. Some people will meet you there, others won't. But if you never step past the surface, you'll never know who's capable of depth. It's not about forcing deep conversations all the time. It's about being intentional, about noticing when your heart is hungry for more than casual banter. It's about giving yourself permission to ask the second question, the one beneath the "I'm fine." It's about showing up with a little more honesty than the moment expects, because that's how you find the people who are listening for more than just your words. And if you're in relationships where everything stays on the surface, Start paying attention to how that makes you feel, not with blame, but with curiosity. Are you holding back? Is there room to go deeper? Or have you both silently agreed to keep it light so no one has to feel too much? These are the questions that matter. Not to judge the relationship, but to guide it. Because if the connection really means something, it deserves a chance to grow roots. When small talk starts feeling like a wall, that's your sign. Not to walk away, but to look for the door. Sometimes that door is just one honest sentence, one real question, one moment of truth, spoken gently, but without apology. That's how you start breaking the wall, one brick at a time. People pleasing sounds like kindness on the surface. And to be fair, it often starts with good intentions. You want people to feel comfortable. You want to keep things peaceful. You want to avoid conflict. So you say yes when you're tired. You agree when you actually disagree. You go along just to get along. And for a while, it seems to work. People are happy with you. You're seen as dependable, easygoing, the one who never causes problems. But underneath all that approval is something quieter, the slow fading of your own voice. You don't notice it at first. You're just being helpful, just avoiding unnecessary tension. But after a while, you realize you're not saying what you really think anymore. You start hesitating before you speak, running every word through a filter of, will they be upset? Or will this make things awkward? And somewhere in all that editing, you lose the raw, honest part of yourself, the part that has opinions, boundaries, limits, and needs, the part that actually belongs in the conversation. What people don't always see is that people pleasing isn't harmless. It's exhausting. It pulls you into emotional overdrive, constantly managing other people's reactions, constantly trying to read the room, constantly trying to stay 2 steps ahead of disappointment. And the emotional weight of that adds up. You smile on the outside, but inside, you're anxious, frustrated, and quietly resentful. Not because anyone forced you to be that way, but because somewhere along the way, you believed that being liked mattered more than being real. And the longer you stay in that role, the harder it becomes to find your way back to your voice. You second guess yourself. You downplay your emotions. You convince yourself that your needs are too much or your truth is too hard. And here's where it gets painful. You start shrinking not just for strangers or acquaintances, but for the people closest to you. You adjust yourself in relationships not because it's healthy, but because you're scared that the real you might be too difficult to love. But here's what I want you to hear. Your voice matters, not just the polite, agreeable version, the real one, the one with edges and depth and needs, the one that says, I'm not okay with this, or this doesn't work for me, or I need something different. That voice isn't a problem. It's a part of you that deserves a seat at the table. The truth is, not everyone will like your honesty. Not everyone will applaud your boundaries, but the people who truly value you, not just the version of you that keeps things easy, they'll respect it. They'll adjust, or they'll leave. And if they leave, let them. Because approval that costs you your voice isn't love. It's control wrapped in politeness. You don't have to be rude to be honest. You don't have to be loud to be heard. But you do have to be clear, and clarity only comes when you stop performing and start honoring your truth. That's how you get your voice back. One honest sentence at a time. Passive aggression is one of those things that sneaks into relationships quietly. It doesn't come in yelling or slamming doors. It shows up in the cold shoulder, the sarcastic comment, the delayed response that says, I'm upset, but I'm not going to tell you why. And on the surface, it can seem like no big deal. Just a little moodiness, a little tension. But underneath, something much deeper is happening. Because passive aggression isn't just about avoiding conflict. It's about withholding honesty. And when honesty is withheld long enough, trust starts to slowly erode. The truth is, a lot of passive aggression comes from people who feel unheard. People who've tried to express themselves in the past and were met with defensiveness, dismissal, or disconnection. So now, instead of saying, that hurt me, they say, it's fine, with a tone that means the exact opposite. Instead of asking for support, they overfunction, then silently resent you for not offering. It's not manipulation as much as it is a survival mechanism. You've been conditioned to believe that being direct doesn't feel safe. So you find other ways to express what you're feeling without ever really saying it. But here's the quiet damage that does to a relationship. It creates confusion. It forces the other person to guess what's wrong instead of being told. It turns the connection into a puzzle where every word has a hidden meaning and every silence feels loaded. That guessing game doesn't build intimacy. It builds distance. Because eventually the other person stops trying to read between the lines. They stop asking. They stop leaning in. Not because they don't care, but because they don't know how to win a game they never agreed to play. Passive aggression also does something to you. It keeps you stuck in a loop of quiet resentment. You don't say what's really on your heart, so your needs never actually get met. And then when they go unmet, that resentment grows, not just toward the other person, but toward yourself. Because deep down, you know you're not being honest. And the longer that builds, the more isolated you feel, even in the middle of the relationship. If you recognize yourself in this, I want you to hear this gently. It doesn't make you a bad person. It means you've learned to protect yourself in a way that made sense at the time, but it's not serving you anymore. And it's definitely not serving the relationship. Real connection can only grow in truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable, even when it risks tension. Being honest doesn't mean being harsh. It means saying, I felt hurt when that happened, instead of pretending it didn't matter. It means asking for what you need instead of punishing someone for not reading your mind. It means choosing clarity over cleverness, responsibility over subtle revenge. Relationships need safety, and safety is built through emotional honesty. Not guessing, not avoidance, but the quiet, consistent courage to speak what's true, kindly and directly. That's how you start repairing the cracks. Not by hoping the other person will magically figure it out, but by owning your voice, not to control the outcome, but to finally set yourself free. Control feels safe, at least on the surface. When things feel uncertain, when someone's words or actions start to hit that tender spot in you, the instinct is to manage it, to fix it, to get ahead of the discomfort before it gets ahead of you. So you raise your voice, you explain again, you overfunction, overreact, overreach, not because you're trying to hurt anyone, but because deep down you're scared of being misunderstood, scared of being left, scared that if you don't take charge, things will fall apart. And in that fear, control can start to look like care. But what it actually does is push people further away. Control says, if I can just get them to change, then I'll feel better. But composure says, even if they don't change, I can still stay grounded in who I am. That's a hard shift to make, especially if you've been hurt before or grew up in an environment where unpredictability felt dangerous. When your nervous system is trained to respond to stress with urgency, control feels like power. But real power isn't about who listens to you. It's about how you carry yourself when they don't. In relationships, the desire for control often hides behind good intentions. You want to solve the argument. You want to protect the relationship. You want to be heard. But the way that need shows up, maybe through micromanaging, pressure, criticism, shutdowns, it ends up doing the very thing you're trying to avoid. It erodes trust, because what people feel is not your care. They feel your tension. They feel the tight grip, the urgency, the emotional chaos underneath the surface. And that makes them pull away, not out of spite, but out of self-protection. Composure, on the other hand, doesn't mean you don't feel. It means you've learned how to respond rather than react. It's a steady posture that says, I can hold my ground without needing to control yours. It's not cold. It's not detached. It's present. It's calm. It's strength that doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. And sometimes that composure is what invites the other person to soften, because you're no longer feeding the fire with your fear. You're modeling stability with your presence. This isn't about perfection. There are going to be moments when your emotions spike and your words come out sharp. That's human. But when your default becomes control, you lose access to connection. You stop listening. You start managing. And the relationship becomes a transaction, not a bond. So when you feel that urge rise, the one that says, I need to make this go my way, that's your cue. Not to tighten your grip, but to loosen it. Not to demand, but to breathe. To ask yourself, what's the story I'm telling myself right now? And is it helping me stay grounded? Composure is not weakness. It's restraint with purpose. It's choosing to stay rooted in your values instead of being pulled into emotional chaos. And the more you practice it, the more you realize that you don't need to control everything to feel safe. You just need to stay connected to yourself. And let that be enough. You ever walk into a room and feel the need to shrink just a little, not physically, but emotionally, mentally, like you need to take up just a little less space. Be a little quieter. Tone yourself down. Maybe it's because you've been told you're too much, too opinionated, too emotional, too driven. Or maybe no one said it outright, but you felt it in the way someone rolled their eyes when you were excited about something, in how they changed the subject when you shared something meaningful, and the way your joy was met with silence instead of support. So you started dimming, not all at once, but slowly, quietly, just enough to stay safe. That dimming becomes a habit. At first, it feels like wisdom, like emotional maturity, like you're learning how to be more manageable for the people around you. You convince yourself it's for the greater good. That being low Maintenance will keep the peace. That being agreeable will help you stay connected. But what's really happening underneath all that is self-erasure. You're not being easier to love, you're becoming harder to see. And the longer you do that, the more distant you start to feel from yourself. This isn't about attention seeking. It's not about needing the spotlight or being the loudest in the room. This is about something much more quiet and sacred, your light, the part of you that gets excited about ideas, that wants to share your thoughts, that feels things deeply and fully, that knows your value even when others can't see it yet. And that light is supposed to be visible, not so you can prove something, but so you can live something real, something whole, something honest. In a lot of relationships, especially when there's imbalance or insecurity in the dynamic, your light can start to feel threatening to someone else. Maybe they feel intimidated by your confidence. Maybe they feel small when you're thriving. Maybe they've only known connection through control, so your independence feels like rejection. And because you care, because you want to protect the relationship, you begin to dim to keep the other person comfortable. You stay quiet so they can feel heard. You stop celebrating wins so they don't feel behind. You laugh less, share less, shine less, until what's left is a filtered version of you. But here's the thing, you cannot protect someone else's ego without wounding your own soul. And every time you dim to make someone else feel safe, you're reinforcing the belief that their comfort matters more than your truth, that their insecurity gets to set the tone for how bright you're allowed to be. And that's not love. That's emotional survival. That's fear disguised as compassion. You might tell yourself, I'm just being considerate, or I don't want to make them feel bad, but deep down there's a cost, and that cost shows up in the form of burnout, frustration, resentment, and disconnection, not just from others, but from yourself. You start to wonder why you feel unfulfilled, why your relationships feel flat, why your days feel heavier than they should. And if you trace it back, you'll often find it leads to a place where you stop being fully you. You were never meant to live filtered. You were never meant to be edited to fit into someone else's insecurities. Your light is not a threat, it's a gift. And yes, not everyone will know how to receive it. Some people will walk away, some will criticize, some will stay, but try to mold you into a version that feels more manageable for them. And that's painful. But it's also revealing, because the people who are truly for you, they won't ask you to shrink. They'll make room. They'll adjust their eyes to the brightness. They'll cheer you on, not because it benefits them, but because it's who you are. You don't have to dim to be loved. You don't have to be smaller to feel safe. In fact, the spaces where you feel the need to hide parts of yourself, those are clues. Clues that maybe the environment isn't aligned with your growth. Clues that maybe the connection is based more on your compliance than your authenticity. And those clues aren't there to shame you. They're there to wake you up. It takes courage to stop dimming. It takes risk to step into your full light, knowing it might change the dynamics around you. But that risk is worth it, because living fully seen is better than being half loved. Speaking your truth is better than being silently accepted. And showing up as your whole self, even if it ruffles feathers, is what real confidence looks like. Not the loud kind, the rooted kind. The kind that doesn't need to convince anyone. It just is. So if you've been holding back, take a moment and ask yourself, who taught you that your light was too much? Who made you feel like your joy was inconvenient? And are you still carrying their voice inside your head today? Then ask yourself this, what would it look like to stop shrinking? Not to rebel, not to swing to the other extreme, but to simply take up the space that's already yours, to speak honestly, to celebrate fully, to move through life without constantly checking if your shine is making someone else uncomfortable. The world needs your full self, not the version that fits in, not the version that's polite at the expense of your peace, but the full, flawed, radiant version of you. The one that lights up rooms not because you're trying to impress, but because you're no longer hiding. So let this be your reminder, you don't have to dim to belong. You don't have to shrink to be loved. You get to be fully seen, fully heard, and fully respected, not in spite of your light, but because of it. And the people who can hold that, those are the ones who are worth holding on to. Laughing it off can feel like a shield. You take the joke, the comment, the jab, and instead of letting it land, you turn it into a laugh. You smile through it, shake your head, maybe throw something witty back. On the outside, you look easygoing. You look unbothered. People think you've got thick skin. But what they don't see is what happens after, when you're alone, playing that moment back in your mind, wondering why it stung the way it did, wondering if you're too sensitive or if that comment actually crossed the line, wondering why it keeps happening and why you keep letting it. That habit, laughing it off didn't come from nowhere. It comes from history. Maybe you grew up in a family where emotions were uncomfortable, where toughen up was the message when things hurt. Maybe you learned early on that if you wanted to keep the peace, you needed to stay pleasant, light, agreeable. Maybe you figured out that showing pain invited ridicule, not support. So now when something hits a nerve, your reflex is to turn it into a joke. You brush it off, you minimize it, and you do it so well, most people never even realize they crossed a line. But here's the hard part: when you're always laughing it off, people stop taking you seriously. They stop noticing when you're hurt. They stop realizing that what they said or did actually mattered because you didn't show them. And over time, that disconnect builds, not just in your relationships, but in you. You start to feel like nobody really sees you. Nobody asks how you're doing, not because they don't care, but because they think you're always fine. They think you're always okay because that's the version you keep giving them. And I want to say this clearly: you don't have to keep performing strength just to stay close to people. You don't have to wear humor like armor. It's okay to say, that hurt. It's okay to say, I didn't like that. You can still be kind and be clear, still be gracious and have boundaries. Humor is a beautiful thing, but it can't carry your pain. Not forever. At some point, your heart is going to need more than a punchline. It takes courage to stop covering up discomfort with a smile, because the truth is, being honest can feel vulnerable. It can feel risky. You don't know how the other person will respond. Will they dismiss you? Will they double down? Will they get defensive? That fear is real. And sometimes it's easier, safer, to just laugh. But here's what I've learned: the more you make space for honesty, the more you attract people who can actually hold it. The more you speak up, the more your relationships reflect who you truly are, not who you pretend to be. Think about the last time someone said something that didn't sit right with you, but you let it slide. Maybe it was a harmless comment about your appearance, a dig at your work ethic, a joke at your expense in front of others, and maybe you laughed along, maybe you even laughed the loudest, but inside something shifted. Something in you said, I didn't like that. That small moment matters, because the more of those you collect, the heavier your silence becomes. And eventually, the smile you wear starts to feel like a mask that doesn't come off. The pain behind always laughing it off is the pain of never feeling safe enough to be real. It's the pain of being misunderstood, not because people aren't willing to understand, but because you've taught them there's nothing to understand. It's the loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who like your personality but don't know your heart. And that's not your fault, but it is something you can begin to shift. That shift doesn't mean becoming cold or confrontational. It just means allowing space for honesty alongside the humor. When someone makes a joke that cuts too deep, you don't have to laugh just to keep it light. You can say, I know that was supposed to be funny, but it didn't sit right with me. That one sentence can start to change everything. Because now you're showing up. Now you're letting people see the real impact of their words. Now you're giving yourself permission to be heard. You deserve relationships where you don't have to choose between being liked and being respected. You deserve to be around people who listen when you speak, not just when you smile. And that starts by choosing your truth, even when it's uncomfortable, even when your voice shakes a little, even when the laugh would be easier. It might feel messy at first. It might catch people off guard. Some won't know what to do with the more honest version of you. But the ones who matter, they'll adjust, they'll lean in, they'll ask more questions, and they'll start to see you. Not just the mask, but the full story behind it. So if you've been carrying pain behind your smile, I want you to hear this. You're allowed to put the mask down. You're allowed to stop performing. Your pain doesn't need to be palatable for it to be valid. You don't have to laugh to be loved. You don't have to be entertaining to be worthy. You just have to be real. And that's more than enough.